Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Hi there. Welcome and welcome back to everyone joining us on Rooted to Thrive, Conversations to Elevate Our Humanity podcast. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson-Ansari, aka Professor P. Now today we have the Dr. Ann Aviles, who is a professor of human development and family science at the University of Delaware. And she's the author of the book From Charity to Equity, Race, Homelessness, and Urban Schools. She's also the co-editor of Latina OX Education in Chicago, Roots, Resistance, and Transformation, among several other publications. And she is also the co-chair of Homes Campaign Delaware. Anne and I met years ago through her cousin and my friend. It actually was 18 years ago. Can you believe that? 18 years ago. While she was still in her hometown of Chicago, Illinois. And we became fast friends and family now. And Anne, I want to thank you for joining me today to share your brilliance, your heart for the most vulnerable among us, and your infectious, joyful spirit. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me, Rochelle. I am well. We're hitting fall, so a lot of transition.
Yes, good.
So just trying to ease to the fall and get back into the routine of things.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I'm excited to have you speak on the topic today, the hidden crisis, housing insecurity, and its impact on education and health. But to get started, why don't you share a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this work?
Sure. So absolutely. So thank you for having me to allow me to share my perspectives, my experience, right, in working with families, students, youth experiencing homelessness or housing instability. You'll hear me kind of use those interchangeably because most people know the word homelessness. Um, it doesn't fully capture people's housing experiences, which is why I try to say like housing instability or unstable housing, just to better recognize that it isn't just people living on the streets, right? That's more of a street homelessness, but there are many people who do not have consistent, stable housing or who are unstably housed. They could be staying with family or friends and things of that nature. So I'll kind of use them interchangeably, but I'm referring to the same notion. But just sometimes I think it's good for us to push on some of these words, right? So that people understand that it's more than what's on the surface. Okay, where can I start? So I started working in a domestic violence agency. This was in the late 90s. This would have been about 1997. I'm on the south side of Chicago. As part of my training as an occupational therapist, I was working on my undergrad in occupational therapy and had the opportunity to have a internship at this domestic violence agency that was a shelter, housing shelter for women and children who had become homeless because of domestic violence. So that was my first introduction to homelessness. And I really was just taken by the young people there. It was 6 to 12-year-olds. We did a lot of work with the young children, focusing more on their health, their well-being, in particular their development, because unstable housing, right, can have a negative impact on kids' development. So we were doing a lot of assessments to ensure that they were developing appropriately. And we were also focused on their mental health because many of them had either been exposed to, right, through their parents or um, had actual experiences with domestic violence. And so our job was to help the young people process, right, what had happened, but also to not repeat the cycle of violence. And so we did a lot in that before and after school classroom to encourage young people to use their words, not their hands, right? And this was part of obviously the domestic violence shelter. They would say like hands are not for hitting, right? So that was my first exposure, and I really enjoyed that. And I know that sounds a little like weird to say you enjoyed working at a shelter, but I enjoyed the community. I enjoyed meeting the people and the young kids. Also recognizing that many of the stereotypes that myself and others, right, had been exposed to through media, through education, that they were not very accurate. These women were strong women, you know, they were in bad situations. The kids were great kids. They were in, you know, unstable housing situation. So it definitely pushed back on a lot of these stereotypes.
Mm.
Um, and so through that work, I really, like I said, enjoyed it. And when I decided I wanted to come back for a master's degree, I reached out to my clinical supervisor, who was a faculty member in that program. And she had gotten a grant basically to look at the relationship between domestic violence and disability. And so when I told her that I was interested in focusing on community-based occupational therapy, she informed me of an opportunity to come back as a grad assistant, which would be free. So I was like, yes, please. And so I ended up coming back and I worked with her, Dr. Christine Helfrich, on looking at the relationship between domestic violence and disability. And through that work, I ended up doing my own work at a youth shelter. So this was for unaccompanied youth ages 14 to 21 who are not in the care of a consistent adult or guardian. And that's where I really kind of took off in terms of really getting um, embedded in kind of better understanding housing, homelessness, housing instability, specifically for youth that were not who didn't have that stable parent figure and who were basically trying to navigate life on their own.
Okay, thank you so much. And I want to know, I'm curious, right? What came to mind for you when you heard the title of this podcast, right? So we said Rooted to Thrive, conversations that elevate our humanity. What came to mind for you in turn, like what came to mind
Yeah.
and what played into the decision about what you would talk about today?
Um, Well, I think rooted to thrive just says so much. We hear a lot about surviving. We don't always hear
Mhm.
about thriving. And so I think for me, a lot of, as I shared, the people that I've met have a resilience that is just unmatched, right?
Okay.
Um, and they do more than survive. They really do thrive and thrive in big and small ways. And I think again, we assume that thriving looks a particular way. Um, However, when you don't have that stability, I think we also need to think about how people thrive and how they're persistent despite the challenges and the barriers.
I love it. I love it. What are we at promise for? We should have called that episode that. Love it. I love it. So, throughout the podcast, we want our listeners to grow. We want them to strengthen in their anti-racism, in their cultural competence, in their inclusive practices. And I'd like for you to start talking to us about housing insecurity, education, and health, and how they connect, uh, to building or support, right, for people
Mhm.
who are housing insecure, what one might do to strengthen their anti-racism muscles, their cultural competence, or inclusive practice.
Okay. So one, I would start with just how we define homelessness or housing insecurity. So I will say some of this is unfortunately because of policy, right? So housing and urban development, the federal government defines homelessness in a very particular way. And it's what most of us think of homelessness. It's people living on the street, it's people residing in shelters.
Mm-hmm.
There is also, though, and this is why I was so interested in writing the book From Charity to Equity, Race, Homelessness in Urban Schools, is because McKinney-Vento is the education policy that guarantees students and families experiencing homelessness the right to an education. So one, I want people to know that McKinney-Vento exists. It has been around since 1987. And that definition is much more broad and inclusive because it says anyone who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. So, one, I want people to understand the complexity, right, of housing instability, that it is not just people that we see out on the street, right? We do need to be concerned about people who are experiencing street homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Hidden, right, piece is the people who are staying with friends and family.
Right.
And because of the stigma, right, associated with poverty and homelessness, a lot of people do try to stay under the radar.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, I think this is not as prevalent now, but it does depend the state and your policy and your law. But for example, women who, I shouldn't say women, parents who are not stably housed, right? In the past, that could be considered child endangerment. So definitely as the people who may interact with, right, folks experiencing homelessness, we have to listen for clues,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have to ask different kinds of questions. Like, for example, if someone, a student talks about staying at auntie's house one week, and then they're at grandma's house another week,
Right.
and their mom's house, you're like, okay, there seems to be like some shuffling happening,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And to say, is housing a challenge, or are you, staying at multiple places? How is that affecting you? Like, are you able to sleep well? Are you able to get your work done? Right? Whatever it might be, because then it opens up the conversation. A lot of the people in schools try, those that I would say have been trained really well, try not to even say the word homeless because of all the stigma that comes with it.
Right. And you're suggesting that people ask these questions to listen for clues to show how they can serve them, not get parents in trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. No, our goal is a child who is already experiencing instability does not need to be removed from, I mean, unless there's a real threat there, right? So that's always the caveat, but it's only going to cause more disruption for that child by not being able to be with around people that are familiar, people they feel safe with, right? And we're going to do more harm if we remove them from that family unit.
Right.
So yeah, so absolutely, the goal is not to be punitive. The goal is to be supportive.
Right.
So I also would love it if our social service agencies, in particular, some of our governmental agencies,
Mhm.
had different processes in place for families. So I'll give you one example. Working with a family right now, they're trying to find housing. There's several children in the household. Mom works, oldest daughter works, right? And they, um, because there's a housing shortage also in our nation of about 4.3 million units for the number of low income tenants that need it.
Mm.
Even if you have a job and you have the money, it still can be really hard to find housing,
Right.
right? So So that's one example. I'll give you one other example just in terms of people working,
Mhm.
right? So there's a great organization, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, NLIHC, National Income Housing Coalition. I had to make sure I'm getting the acronym right. And they have these wonderful, like one-pager snapshots for states across the US, and then for larger states like California, also for the municipalities or the cities across that state. So they focus on what they call a housing wage. And so Homes Campaign Delaware, we've adopted that, right? And we don't even talk about a living wage anymore. We say it is a housing wage. So what they have done is they say, oh, okay, I'm going to just give Delaware because I know these numbers. In Delaware, it minimum wage is about $8 an hour, right? And so they look at the the I'm sorry, median cost of housing, right? And they say, okay, in the state of Delaware, someone needs to make about between 20 and $25 an hour in order to have a housing wage, right? The federal government says households should not spend more than 30% of their income on housing. If you spend more than 30% of your income on housing, you are considered rent or cost burdened because you have less money to spend on all the other needs.
Mhm.
So you go, okay, that's a structural problem because
Yeah.
I don't have control over what my wages are, right, as the person working. So I can be working really hard and still end up homeless,
Mhm.
right? Or still end up being evicted because I don't have the money, right? That's a structural problem, right? And when we look at people's wages, we know, unfortunately, women, right, still earn less than men for every dollar.
Mhm.
85 cents on the dollar, 83
Mhm.
cents, something like that for women. When you add in other identities of like if you're undocumented, if you're a person of color, if you identify as LGBTQ, you see the wages just keep going to down, right? So was just having this discussion in one of my classes when we controlled for education, but when it came to race, right, and gender, there were still pay disparities. So if we all have the same education, then shouldn't we all be making the same amount of money?
Right. It creates it.
Yeah.
Yes. And, we are concerned about people's health and well-being. And I know you have said that housing, right, is directly related to your well-being
Yes.
as well.
How, yes,
Mhm.
housing is health, right?
Mm.
So if we think about the social determinants of health, right? Social determinants of health is basically where people live, grow, play, age, right? And so all the data again shows that people's life expectancy is more determined by your zip code than any other factor. So how do we help people see that yes, we all are flawed and we all can make bad decisions with our money. That's not usually what makes people homeless though, right? But that's the narrative people are told. Like a lot of the solutions, like right now we've had this discussion many times. They have uh, financial coaches,
Mhm.
right? They're
Right.
like, well, we just need to teach them how to manage their money. I'm like, do you know how well poor people manage money? Do you understand like the mental gymnastics that folks who only have a little bit of money go through to make that dollar stretch? They
Mhm.
don't need money management. They need to get paid better,
Right.
right? Like they need more money. Like, how do you manage money you don't have?
Right.
So that's what I mean, that's what I have said to legislators and other people who say, well, they just, no, 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 no. And again, we could all benefit from these things, right?
Right.
So for me, when I think, sorry, I know I'm going on a little tangent. So in terms of the health piece, that social determinants of health is really thinking about housing as healthcare, right? Because we know if you have safety and stability, the two primary contexts that young people develop in are home and school,
Mhm.
right? When home is no longer safe and stable, school, which is why McKinney Vento to me is so important, school can become safe and stable, right? Kids know their teachers, their friends, it's a familiar place, they feel safe until they get that stability at home. But with you, if you don't have stability at home, right, if you're always moving around, thinking about how kids develop, right? Kids start to explore when they can crawl and move around. Well, if you are living in a car, right, or if you're living in a bedroom because you're staying temporarily with a friend or family, it's very likely that that child, if they don't have other spaces in which they can explore, they're probably going to be stunted, right, in terms of that crawling, that walking. And then as you continue to develop, right, it impacts your brain development, right? What you're exposed to, whether you get enough sleep. If you're staying in a shelter that there's other families that maybe, right, the kids are crying or whatever it might be, like you're losing that sleep. We know sleep is so important for our mental health and our well-being, our cognitive growth, right?
Yes,
Again, young
yes.
kids, your brain is really growing during sleep,
Mhm,
right? So
mhm.
again, if you don't have that routine, that safety, that stability, it's going to hinder development. And there's a ton of data that shows even kids living in poverty, if they have that housing stability, their academic outcomes are better than the kids who are not stably housed.
Yeah, and I thought about the situation where you're in the multiple family home, right, in a space, and you don't have control over what's happening in that space, right? So there could be additional worries,
Yes.
uh, around who comes and goes in the house,
Hmm.
right? And unfortunately, because of the situation that your nuclear family is in, that's where you get to lay your head.
Yep.
However, maybe not restfully.
Exactly. Because
Mm,
you become so vulnerable, right? And we see this
mhm.
a lot with young people in particular who end up so the shelter I was sharing I worked at with the 14 to 21 year olds, a lot of young people are if they're looking for housing or they're looking for food and they have someone who's kind to them and nice to them, right, and offers them, it also puts them at risk, right, for sexual violence, for human trafficking, for all of these things, right, because they just are thinking about, I want a stable place to be. And oh, this nice person, right, is helping me. And they don't realize that unfortunately, it could be a part of like what they call the grooming process, right, that they are
Yes.
luring the child in, knowing later on they'll exploit them, right? There's so many other factors that people just don't even consider. And I don't think it's necessarily malicious. I think it's more short-sighted in that most of us, right, our perspective comes from our positionality, right? So what is normal to us. So when that person who says, "Oh, why don't they just go?" And I say, "Well, do they have a car?"
Right.
Right? And
Right.
and even if they have a car, do they have gas? Do they have money to put gas in the car? Right? And so there's just all the other pieces that we don't think about when we've had that stability, right? Or when we have the stability. There's so many pieces that we are not considering.
Yeah. But it sounds like you are a part of some initiatives, collectives that are moving the needle on this.
Trying to.
Whether, yes, yes. And so please talk to us about some strategies that you've seen that have been effective to be support, like
Mhm,
true support that was necessary among people of any age group, for families that experience unstable housing. Uh,
mhm,
I know you did a lot of work around youth in foster care and education. Tell us about what's out there that's been working and even where you're trying to go. Because I hear this
yeah,
home campaign. I'm
yeah,
excited.
yeah.
I want to hear more
So
about that.
absolutely. So one, I would say, what I was sharing earlier is to expand our understanding of right housing and stability, and to try as much as possible to remove the stigma around the term homelessness, right? It really is a condition in terms of it's someone who doesn't have a stable place to live. It's not who they are,
Right.
right? And I think many times people conflate that,
Right.
right? Like, oh, or even when they say the homeless, I'm like, no, it is a person experiencing homelessness, right? So I think even reframing to put the humanity, the person first, it is a person having this experience, right? And I'm hoping that even that small shift in description will help us see it as a person, right? Experiencing this issue, right? Rather than the person is the issue,
Correct.
right? And I just think, again, that just for me completely changes how I approach it, right? Because it's
Yes,
a person in this situation.
it does.
So that's one piece. I think knowing your rights.
Mm.
In Delaware, we have something called landlord tenant code. Many states have landlord tenant code, and that is basically the guidebook for
Mhm.
landlords and for tenants. Like, what are your roles? What are your responsibilities? What
Mhm.
do you do if you need a repair done in your unit, right? What is the proper process and procedure for reaching out to your landlord, right? Like here in Delaware, it has to be in writing, where in other places, doesn't have to be, right? So know your local rules around housing. Many states, and this is work we did through the Homes campaign here in Delaware. So I should also say HOME stands for, it's an acronym like everything else, right? It's housing, opportunity, mobility, equity, and stability,
Mm.
right? HOME.
Say that one more time.
Housing, opportunity,
Mhm.
mobility, equity, and stability. Our foundation is that housing is a human right and that everyone should have access to safe, stable, and adequate housing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Period.
Mhm.
So yeah, so we've done a lot of work, kind of what I'm sharing here. We do renter right workshops because we want renters to know their rights. Many times, as I said, landlords will take advantage. Not all landlords, there's
Mhm.
some good landlords as well, but it's the landlords who, right, they have histories of not doing well. And sometimes it's a landlord who doesn't know the rules. And that's why
Right.
I say everyone know landlord tenant code.
Mhm.
Tenant, landlord, like know what the rules are of your state or of your city to make sure you're not doing something wrong
Correct.
as the landlord. So we got something passed called the right to representation. Now, let me tell you now, it's not perfect, but it helps.
Okay.
So right to representation, what the data was showing was that when people go to court, landlords, about 86% of landlords had some type of legal representative when they went to court. Tenants had about 2 to 4% of tenants had legal representation when they went to court. Not equitable, not fair, right?
Correct.
As tenants, we're not lawyers. We don't, like we don't know. So we worked it was a coalition of groups, including the ACLU of Delaware, legal organizations who defend people in court. And last August, oh gosh, maybe it was August of 23, we got a right to representation passed in the state of Delaware. So now when someone is facing eviction, they have to meet certain criteria and it's based on income, but they get free legal representation, right? So it's just small things like that. And what we tell people, we encourage people is to have a positive relationship with your landlord, right? Because people
Mhm.
understand, we're all human. Well, at least some people understand, right? But ignoring them is only going to make your situation worse,
Yeah.
right? So you
Yeah.
want to communicate with them and, hey, I'm having this issue has happened. Like I'm gonna get you your, whatever it is.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so that's more the prevention.
Mhm.
In terms of people who are currently experiencing homelessness, we've been trying to work on a homeless bill of rights
Mm.
in order to protect the well-being of people experiencing homelessness. And so let me start by saying it is not additional protections, right? It is, we all have rights
Yeah.
as citizens, right?
Mhm.
As of the nation. And oftentimes, when people are experiencing homelessness, their rights are violated. So, one example is we can all go to the park and hang out, right?
Mhm.
Fall asleep, not a big deal. No one will bother you.
Mhm.
However, if you are, I'll say, visibly, right, to the naked eye experiencing homelessness, and you're laying on a bench or you're sleeping in the park, you'll probably be harassed, right? You'll probably be told you can't do that, you got to keep moving. Well, why? Because the person who's housed has the right to go lay in the park. So
Right.
why doesn't the person experiencing homelessness have that same right?
Well, that's fantastic. Yes, that is fantastic work. And that's yet another oh, that's the same Homes campaign
Yes.
is
Yeah.
working on that.
So we,
Okay,
yeah,
yes.
we have Homes campaign, and then we've done a little bit of an offshoot to a tenant union
Mm,
because right now, unfortunately, so the right to representation is great. It's still limited because they are focused on eviction. And so if you have a conditions issue in your home, so, a
all right.
repair that needs to happen, the courts are so overwhelmed that they don't even see those in court right now, at least for Delaware court. I can't speak for others.
Mhm.
So what we've been trying to do is let people know what their rights are. And then for these conditions cases, we're trying to organize tenants so that they know they have a right to hold their landlords accountable for things that they should be doing under the law, right?
Right,
And so trying to organize tenants so that they can be their own advocates.
right. And but I would say that pretty much what every city should have, or definitely state, have some kind of advocacy arm for people who are living in conditions, right, that put their health at risk. No, not necessarily.
A lot of places do have tenant unions, or renters unions. There's, but and there is something called license and inspections, and it is their responsibility,
Right.
right? If there is a violation. So that's a tricky one
Right.
because what
Mm,
we tell tenants is, one, like, how bad is the condition? Because if it's really bad and you call L&I, then you're probably going to lose your housing, right?
mm,
Because if they deem the building uninhabitable, then now you don't have any place to go. And so that's like a catch 22, right? Because you're like, it's a really bad condition, but I don't have anywhere else to go.
mm.
So what we try to prepare tenants for is, if you're going to make that call, you need a plan B,
Right.
right? We had maybe 2 or 3 summers ago that happened, and the people, it was Adams Street. There were many families displaced, and Adams Street, that dwelling still has not been rehabilitated enough to allow people to come back. And
Mm.
many of those families are still trying to find housing 3 years later.
Wow. So
Yeah.
this is
So
very
those are the kinds of things.
important.
Yeah.
This is very informative. And the one thing I want to be clear, it's we're not a us and them, against all landlords because
Yes. And
actually
it's
yes, I have had property and had tenants as well. And you know, I stopped doing it because I personally felt like I definitely cared about human beings, right? And so in some cases, some people took advantage of that, right? So, we know landlords are people too.
yes. Well, and that's why I said not all landlords. Of course, I'm
Right?
giving you the most extreme,
Exactly. I
but
I just wanted to share it as well because yeah, I get it, right? Like people are either, you don't make a lot of money as a landlord, but
yeah, unless
they're
you're like big
right when
corporate.
people have right multiple buildings, et cetera. Or, I mean, some people do.
Mhm.
There are a lot of small landlords, like I was. It really resonated when you said there are some people who don't know, and they're in a situation. I want us to all see all of our humanness, right? Like in
Mhm.
all of our humanity and evolve to people who want to be, for all of us to experience peace, wellness,
Yeah.
in every area of life. So I really appreciate the work that you all are doing in Delaware. I'm in Philadelphia. Uh, Philadelphia, it has been known to be a tenant-friendly
Mhm.
city in the state of Pennsylvania. And excuse me, and I feel like, some people have taken advantage of that, right, through the court system, but I appreciate that. You know, I appreciate that we all have, that we have advocates because
Mm.
I've seen, unfortunately, like those situations that you're talking about, right? That people were mistreated, or they became current on whatever was owed and still were evicted. That made me think about your renters' rights workshops, right? So you said it's prevention. I I'm assuming that the person who comes to the workshop is usually somebody who's in some dire straits at that point. But
Yeah.
I want to encourage people to do that before, right? Like to get this information before, so you're actually in a, a more powerful position
Yeah.
because you are walking confidently with that information even before, right? Because one thing I'm sure you talk about in these workshops is the ability to communicate, right?
Yeah.
And communicate first
Yes.
the landlord, right? So when I think about my story, I'm like, the number of times I've let people pay late and there wasn't this big fee that they had to pay. Some people take advantage of that, but
Yeah.
some people needed that, right?
Right.
You know, um,
Well,
I
and I
go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say with any, right, any situation, you're always going to have some people that take advantage,
Right.
right, of
Right.
a situation. And so we always say like, okay, of course that, but
Hmm.
what about the like 80 others
Right.
that
It's the
really
majority
need it?
that don't. Right.
Yeah.
The
It's
majority of
and it's yes.
this
Yes.
is true. That is true. But yes, it's just that I don't know if it's the way our brains work or it's human nature that we often don't seek out the information until
Yes.
there's a problem.
Yeah.
But I
It's
would,
very
right, like that if you are renting, period, get the information. Get the
yes.
information, young people, before you move out of your parents' or grandparents' home. You know,
Yeah, and I've been having this conversation with some of, right, younger
mhm,
folks who are just kind of getting out on their own, and this is just to bring it back right to education is
yes.
what, schools could bring some of this curriculum
Mhm.
into, especially, middle, like high school age, right? Like
Yeah.
to know your whatever the local landlord tenant code is, right?
Mhm.
To have an idea of creating a household budget. Like you could build math, you could build research, into these subjects and
Mhm.
or you can align these topics, I should say, with these subjects,
Correct.
right? And
Yeah.
have it be something very practical because we've had so many people, including when I learned landlord tenant code, I was like, oh, well, that makes sense. Like, oh, no wonder, right?
Right. Mhm.
And it's like, well, why didn't I know this before? Right.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's small stuff that is not really egregious. Like I've been sharing some really kind of, the more severe, but even something small like um after a year
Mhm.
when you sign that lease, and this again, it's not in all places, but here in Delaware, after that year, you go to a I'm sorry, a month to month lease, unless you say, I'd like to sign for a full year. Yeah.
Wow. And yes, and just going back to what can happen in schools, all of these matters can be integrated into a number of different subjects as you mentioned, it doesn't have to be like the days of old, but we did in the days of old even have home economics for people to learn how to, right, to
Mhm.
be good citizens. They needed to learn how to take care of their homes, right? And to cook,
Yeah.
you know,
And
and
even budgeting, right? Like
right,
people don't realize, like, no, it's not just your rent. You have to pay electricity, you got to pay
yes,
water, unless it's included in the rent, right? Those are the kinds of
yes,
things, though, like you could, kids would love math if they realized. I don't know if they love it, but at least I think they'd be more motivated. It
yes.
was like very practical.
Yes, and let me tell you, we've done budgeting simulations where middle schoolers had to determine, you know, what they were going to pay for in different family situations. And when I tell you, that was an eye opener for
Yes.
them. Many caregivers thanked us,
Yes, I'm
right?
sure they
But
did.
it's very, one, they can understand at middle school age. And
Yes.
two, it's important information, right? In preparation for adulthood, in preparation to be a citizen, right? Like, so we're in the United States, we live housing, right?
Yes.
For the most part, it is a part of being a citizen. So
Mhm.
why not integrate it? I love it, right? And for people to raise their consciousness about different neighborhoods, different spaces, etc.
Mhm. Okay.
That's what I want to I want people to get more information about that because some people look at the price tag and go, "Oh yeah, well I'll sell it." But then where are you going
Right. And
from
what
there?
can you afford?
What can
Yeah.
you afford when you leave from there? People have to really, understand their rights and understand what can happen
Mhm.
as a result instead of looking at, oh, I'm going to get this chunk of money right
Mhm.
now.
Yeah.
Because what that chunk of money it might have gone a much longer way years ago.
Yes.
Today, it gets you across the street.
Maybe.
Right. Maybe. Well, Anne, it has been an absolute pleasure. I always love talking to you, as you know. But
I
also,
enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
yes, and always appreciate your, your clarity, the passion that you bring, and you're always in the trenches with folks making things happen. So I really
Right.
appreciate you taking the time to share with us. Are there any other resources you haven't mentioned that you want to recommend to people? Um, you talked about changing your language, listening to people. I wonder if there are any resources out there. I don't care what medium it
Yeah,
is.
no, I would say definitely McKinney-Vento,
Yeah.
right? So people know, and I'm going to spell it McKinney dash V like Victor, ENTO, McKinney-Vento. That
Mhm.
is the policy that guarantees students experiencing homelessness the right to an education. It's a federal mandate. And so every district and or school has a liaison or a coordinator, a McKinney-Vento coordinator at the state level, and often McKinney-Vento liaisons at the school or district level. So if you're experiencing housing instability, a lot of parents try to, figure out how to get their kids to and from school, how to pay for uniforms, how to pay those school fees. McKinney-Vento takes care of all of that. It guarantees the student access. It provides transportation. It waives school fees. It often provides, free lunch, breakfast, all these things. So there's this policy out there. And it is your right, I think, and that's why I named my book From Charity to Equity, because people think of this as it's something charitable, which is nice, right? But charity does not get us change. And
Mm,
we need equity. And so know that you have a right to an education, and
Yeah.
that McKinney-Vento is the policy that gives you that right. And so if you're a parent or a student, you should find out who your McKinney-Vento liaison or coordinator is, and make sure that they are enforcing McKinney-Vento in your school or in your district. I would also encourage you to go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website and look up your state and see what the housing wage is for your state. I know a lot of people are talking about, we won the fight for 15. That's not enough, y'all. Like 15 isn't going to cut it. So look and see and advocate for housing wages. And you can do that in big and small ways, right? If you're a mom and pop store, or if you're a large corporation, right? What we try to do with homes is whenever we apply for funding, we always put in a housing wage, and we try to recruit people from the community experiencing housing challenges or that are low income, and we like to employ them even if it's part-time. And we tell them we pay housing wages, and funders who don't want to pay the housing wage, then we will not, then I guess we're not going to get a grant from them, and we're okay with that, because
Right, right.
we're not going to perpetuate, right, the housing instability. If we know better, then we should do better, right? And so we make sure that we pay anyone we work with a housing wage.
Yes. And is there a particular site where people can find the housing wage for their state? Or can they just do a Google search?
No, that's the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Yeah, the NLIHC, the National Low Income Housing Coalition.
Has
If
the
you go to their website, and you can go, they have a state by state breakdown of, and like I said, a large state like California, they even have it broken down by like LA versus San Francisco. And I want to say the last time I looked, like the housing wage in Cali is like 40 something dollars an hour,
right,
right? And no, people are not getting paid that.
right.
Um, the other resource I would say is for anyone who's experiencing a housing challenge is, many states have legal organizations that do provide pro bono legal assistance. So you want to reach out to them and get assistance, and to show up to court if you're facing eviction, right? So that you at least have a chance of remaining in your home, and or um, brokering some kind of deal that says like, okay, instead of in 5 days, you're going to be evicted, like, okay, you're going to get 30 or 60 days to find new housing. So they can help with things of that nature. Um, yeah, those are the top that come to
That's a
mind.
lot. That's a lot.
Yeah,
Thank you.
so I'll stop there.
No, that's wonderful. And I really want to thank you for being so generous with your time and your expertise as always. So is
Thank
there,
you so much.
yes, thank you again. Is there a way people can find you, contact you after?
Absolutely. They can email me. My email,
Mhm.
let
You,
me think. It's AMAVILES at UD like dog, E like Edward L dot edu. You
mhm.
so my first two initials AM, my last name, AM Aviles at udel.edu. I would encourage them, they can, if they Google Homes Campaign Delaware, you can find our website. City of Wilmington Tenant Union, we also have a website, so feel free to reach out. We meet every first and third Wednesday of the month. So feel free to join a meeting, come and learn more about what we're doing and get involved. Because things will not change unless we push the change, and that is what we're trying to do.
That's excellent. Well, thank you again and again. And thank you to everyone who stopped by. Please and subscribe, share this episode, and thank you again for listening to Rooted to Thrive.